welcome to all of you. It's wonderful to have you all here. It's a real treat, as you will see, to welcome Rip Rapson here again. He's been here before. The saga that he's been deeply involved in and greatly responsible for helping to solve is an ongoing saga. But it's not as bad a saga as it was before he started tackling it. And so you'll hear more about that in this point. So welcome everybody. I think we're all in for a great treat. As you know, Rip has been here several times periodically because the problem he has been working on is such a difficult problem, and he has been making the kind of contribution to it that in fact could occur. Some of you have know about the Detroit Grand Bargain. Well, what you may not know is that in my view, it couldn't have happened if Rip Rapson hadn't come to Detroit in 2006, 10 years before the Grand Bargain occurred, more than 10 years. And what Rip Rapson did when he came to the Kresge Foundation from the McKnight Foundation in Minneapolis, where he was also a pace-setting foundation president in bringing about much greater effective collaboration between the McKnight Foundation and the community of Minneapolis and the state of Minnesota. And he then went to the Kresge Foundation, and one of the first things he did, I don't know some of you will know about what the grantee perception reports are. Grantee perception reports were developed by the Center for Effective Philanthropy as a way of giving voice to grantee recipients about how they felt the foundation that was giving them money was doing. Really important. It's the first mechanism for real accountability by foundations in what they're doing. And the first thing that Rip did when he got to the Kresge Foundation was to commission a grantee perception report. And it turned out the grantee perception report had to be perhaps the most blistering report that's ever been done by the Center for Effective Philanthropy. The basic finding was, I think it was an overwhelming proportion of their grantees who felt that the foundation officials didn't really understand what they were doing. That's a pretty significant situation.
Seemed fine to me.
and so Rip had to face the question of whether they publish it or not. He was among his foundation. Kresge was one of the first foundations that actually put that report up on the website so that the public as a whole could see how transparent they are and what kinds of challenges they had to face in order to do well. It's an amazing story. It's a legend in the foundation community that somebody will do that. A number of other foundations have followed suit, but that was the one that really broke the ice and said, this is an accountability method. It's got to be well done, and we're going to do it. Coming into Kresge, Kresge used to be a foundation that focused primarily on grants for buildings and things like that, right? Mm-hmm. Today, according to the research that we've done, Kresge is now it's a $3.6 billion private national foundation dedicated to building and strengthening pathways to opportunity for people with low incomes living in America's cities, including Kresge's hometown of Detroit. So what he's going to talk about today, the title of his speech, I didn't give it to him. He gave us the title, Detroit 2020, A Journey into the Abyss. But the good news is that they're coming out of the abyss. And my point is that what really inspires me about what Rip has done, he arrived in the Detroit 10 years before the Grand Bargain. But what he did, and you're going to see samples of the work that he's done and how he went about doing it, what he did prepared the way for the Grand Bargain. Could never have happened had Rip Rapson not been there working on these same problems and getting some kind of an infrastructure underway so that when the Grand Bargain people wanted the Ford Foundation with $125 million and the Knight Foundation with $30 million and a number of other foundations, I think 17 or 18 foundations. It couldn't have happened if Rip Rapson had not been there and been doing the kinds of things he was doing to prepare the ground for the grand bargain. So I'm not going to embarrass him anymore to say that, but the fact of the matter is it's true, and it's not exaggerated. And now you're going to see that part of why it is the way it is, and why we keep inviting him back to give us a blow-by-blow every couple of years about how things have changed. You're on. Brett, welcome. It's a pleasure to be here again.
Thank you. Joel is always so exceedingly kind and thorough. I really have nothing to add. So thank you all for coming. Just two quick disclaimers. One, I can't tell you how intimidating it is to be in a room with three of my personal heroes. Harding Carter is the gold standard in my book for everything he has touched. David Dodson the same, and Joel Fleishman. So if I stumble and bumble, I'll blame it on them. Second, the drawings. These will probably drive many of you absolutely crazy. They're intended to be sort of points of departure for larger points that I'd like to make. And so there's a lot of writing, there's a lot of color, there's a lot of complete confusion. But I'm going to scroll through them in a way that I hope doesn't force you onto the page too much, but sort of gives you a point of departure into the broader conversation. So the last couple of times I've come, I've talked largely about sort of philanthropic method. How does philanthropy work? Because over the spread of the Kresge experience in Detroit and across the country, I think what we've found is that in many ways, how a foundation approaches a problem and sort of the tools it uses and the machinery it seeks to create can often trump the actual particulars of a transaction or a set of particular investments. I'd like to do something a little bit different today, and that is to sort of take us back to the abyss. Talk to you a little bit about the framework we sought to put in place in 2008 for reasons I'll talk about in just a moment, and take it then forward a full 10 years to sort of see whether we actually executed on this roadmap for progress or not, and you can be the judges of that. But I think what I'm going to do is a little bit different, just sort of try to sort of sketch a spread of 10 years of activity and I hope progress. So first is, I always feel a little bit sheepish about talking about Detroit. I can't tell you how many people say, well, yeah, but Detroit's not like anywhere else, and it's sort of so far gone in one direction or another that it really has no application to my community, whether that's Raleigh or San Antonio or Los Angeles. And I would suggest that I think is not the case, that in many ways Detroit is sort of the emblematic post-industrial city, that it carries with it all of the tensions of racial division, poverty, land use struggles, next generation workforce issues, all of the same things that every city in America is struggling with. Talk a little bit louder? Okay, I'll try. I have a soft voice. Sorry, thank you. Thank you. Yeah.
Thanks.
And I think I'll be interested in your reaction, but I think in many ways, the simple bottom line is that if Detroit can do it, so can other cities. And we've in turn sought to learn from other cities who have done it, whether it's Pittsburgh, whether it's pieces of Cleveland, whether it's Raleigh, but Boston, lots and lots of examples. So let me take you back to 2008 and 2009. This was a tough time for any city in America. We were beginning the Great Recession. The housing foreclosure crisis was sweeping over the country. But Detroit was hit with two additional whammies that were just devastating. First, the automobile industry was in bankruptcy, and the entire supply chain was at risk. I don't know if it's really possible for folks outside of Michigan to understand the tentacles of the automobile industry in a way that sort of really helps you appreciate how devastating these bankruptcies were. Ford barely stayed out of bankruptcy, but GM and Chrysler were in full bankruptcy, and all of the suppliers were at risk. And then finally, which was really the kicker, is our remarkably charismatic mayor, Kwame Kilpatrick, elected at age 31, kind of the hip-hop mayor, and just a brilliant kind of policy nerd. I mean, just it's hard to find too much fault with Kwame, except he was corrupt. And so he ended up being indicted, sent to the federal penitentiary, and took about 50 of his closest friends with him.
Wow.
And so you had a time in 2008, 2009, in which the private sector was in a bunker. They couldn't even do volunteer activities. They were forbidden by the bankruptcy judges to put any resources into the community. You had a public sector that was, well, essentially in jail, and you had a civic sector, nonprofit sector, that was just hanging on by a thread. It had always been fragile and dependent on both the public sector and the private sector for its support, and now there was nothing there. And so in many ways, philanthropy really had to step up. And I proposed doing exactly that to our board, and I must tell you that the blowback was extremely strong. We have 12 board members, 8 of whom do not live in Detroit, and they were reading all of the same news accounts and looking at all the same photojournalistic essays around blight and deprivation that everyone else were, and they just couldn't see their way to pouring additional resources and reputational equity into the game. Similarly, I got a call very early on from the Domestic Policy Council. President Obama had just been elected, and a guy named Derek Douglas called, and he said, you know, the president just came out of a cabinet meeting. He said, I will not permit Detroit to become the Katrina on my watch. And so Derek said, we want to come and announce something. I said, that's great. What do you want to announce? He said, I don't know. I can't figure it out. He said, you know, it's such chaos. And that was sort of a wake-up call. And then third, the Ford Foundation was preparing to sort of withdraw its support for Detroit. And this is, of course, where the Ford Foundation grew. It later moved to New York, but this is its origins. And so I had a long talk with their new president, Luis Urbinez, and basically tried to convince him that there was enough there to work with. And the enough there became this drawing. I just sat in my office on a Saturday and tried to understand whether there were bodies of work that were actually underway, that were reasonably well capitalized, that had distinct leadership, and that if taken collectively could actually add up to a scaffolding that might hold until the public and the private sectors regained their rightful roles. And as you, maybe in your spare time, as you scroll around the drawing, the lower right-hand side talks a little bit about those principles. Why would we try to put together these 9 modules of activity? The top left corner, the green box, talks a little bit about what we were trying to achieve, but fundamentally what we were trying to achieve is just interim stability, just making sure that these 4 forces didn't completely throw Detroit into the river. And the lower left-hand corner sort of signaled some of the questions that we felt that were going to really get called if philanthropy were going to step up in this way, because this was a major departure for philanthropy, probably not just in Southeast Michigan, but probably nationally. You know, it was a pretty audacious undertaking. And so what I want to do, and I'll try to do it reasonably quickly to leave room for your comments and questions, is essentially take this drawing and turn it vertically. Because what we did was to take each one of these 9 modules and try to build out a work plan for each one of them. And as you can see in the little boxes underneath the yellow arrows, each one, again, was led by a different organization. Each one had different constellation of resources available to it. And so the idea was to try to figure out how Kresge, in effect, could be the air traffic controller, how we could sort of continue to shepherd this work while recognizing that other people needed to take the lead in one way or another. And importantly, these were completely interrelated. And if you take away one thing after I'm done, I think you will see that these systems were all intertwined. And the minute you pushed on one, another popped. And the minute that popped, it sort of destabilized something else. And so we'll talk a little bit about it. The other thing are these columns on the bottom. When I first showed this drawing, the previous drawing, to Mayor Bing, this one, he said, well, you got me there on the top, but these aren't my priorities. That's not what I'm about. None of these education, all of the stuff. And I said, well, all right, Mayor, what are you about? And he identified these quite reasonably. I mean, quite reasonably. Public safety, creation of jobs, improving public administration, stewarding finances, all the things that high-functioning municipal government should be. And so what we'll see in the course of this is that there was not only a weave among these sort of philanthropic efforts on the top, but an attempt to line with the public sector. I think seem straightforward, but again, it was operating at such a low level of efficacy that it was really tough to do. So what I'm going to do is start in the middle. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Where am I? I'm going to be 4, 5. Well, I'll figure it out. Let me turn the page and I'll figure out where I am. This is actually the 5th module. One of the really difficult things in trying to execute against these 9 modules was the realization that we had to stabilize the tax base. There was just insufficient revenue coming in every year to support essential city services. So all those columns on the bottom were completely under-resourced, undercapitalized. And they weren't going to get capitalized by the federal government, by the state government, unless we encourage people to stay in town, invest in businesses in town, and just to sort of basically stabilize the core. And I'll come back to why that actually was a difficult decision, but it ended up being the right decision. And as you scroll around this drawing, it's way too complicated, I apologize. But you can see that there are 2, 4, 6, however many, 8 or 9 different systems in which we sought to invest. Because again, we found that as you invest in the arts and culture ecology, it actually had a lot to do with whether you could run mass transit up the corridor to get people to the arts organizations. So let me talk about just a couple. The first is the upper right-hand corner, is the sort of the system of community development. And here the huge breakthrough was the advantage of being a national foundation. We sit on the board with something called Living Cities that terrorized Hotting for many years. And that is a consortium of national foundations, national banks, and HUD. And for years and years, that organization existed to capitalize community development intermediaries, LISC, Local Initiative Support Corporation, and the Enterprise Foundation. We encouraged them to pivot and to actually pick 4 or 5 places where their combined power of banking, financial institutions, and philanthropy could actually land in a place and make a difference. And so the first we were able to convince them to choose was Detroit. And what happened is they gave us a relatively small amount of grant money to put into our leading community development institution along the corridor that had a big pipeline of projects that needed to get going and was insufficiently staffed, and to bring some of the loan capital from its financial institutions into town. They ended up putting almost $25 million into those 2 channels, and it was life-changing. We began to build out a community development finance capacity. We were able to underwrite the personnel needs of this very effective community development institution, and we begin to sort of infuse a lot of the projects that just had huge financing gaps with some of the money from MetLife and Prudential and others. A huge move, but again, just one system among many. The second I want to call your attention to is this talent attraction and capacity building. One of the huge tensions in Detroit was the sense that we've done it for a long time the very same way, and you've all seen this in one form or another. Breaking out of that pattern in Detroit was really tough. The idea that you would go grab some national resources, whether it was community development finance or something else, was really hard. And so we tried to split the difference and created something called the Detroit Neighborhood Revitalization Fellows Program. It was a shameless steal from New Orleans. We just went down to New Orleans. They had done this. The Rockefeller Foundation had done this post-Katrina. And we created a program in which we had 30 fellows each year. A third were Detroiters, a third were people who had been in Detroit and who had left Detroit, and a third had no connection whatsoever to Detroiters. And these were to Detroit. And these were architects, engineers, social entrepreneurs. They brought their sort of skills and interests into a mix. We weren't sure we could attract people in the very beginning. We had 700 applications for 30 positions in the first year. And we then took these, paid their salaries, and placed them into key community institutions, sometimes 2 in an institution, sometimes 1 into the mayor's office. And we did this in 2-year cycles for 5 cycles. And so over the course of 5 or 10 years, we ended up having 100 and 130 Detroit Neighborhood Revitalization Fellows placed. And what's so incredible is 90% of them stayed after their term. Wow. And it became viral because these were young, fast-moving, ambitious people who would go grab their friends, and it began this sort of talent magnet that really came to characterize Detroit in the pre-bankruptcy era. The final one, is just very quickly, is the anchor institutions. We have sitting right in the middle of this corridor, which is the Woodward Avenue corridor that runs right up the center of the city. The Henry Ford Hospital System, the Detroit Medical Center, Wayne State University, and others. And we said if we could get those organizations to be less sort of insular and more sort of outward facing, we could actually make a huge contribution in terms of where they purchase their goods and services, whom they hire, and encouraging their employees to live in the neighborhood. And so we created a set of incentives that matched their investments, and were able to create a live, work, hire program that had enormous short-term impact. These were quick turnaround things. We needed something that could be demonstrated quickly and effectively. And within a year or two, I think the three institutions had gotten almost 1,000 of their employees collectively to live. Doesn't sound like a lot, but in a place like Detroit, where all of the energy was outward, it was huge. They began purchasing programs to sort of encourage small businesses in the neighborhood to do their window washing or their food service or something. And it had a sort of a steamroller effect that became quite powerful. The next module sort of plays off of the first one. One of those systems I just described was the system of small business and economic development. There's probably nothing more important to the early stabilization of Detroit than to try to create an entrepreneurial ecology in the place of what had traditionally been a command and control economy. I mean, you had the autos essentially speccing out what they needed, sending it into their supply chain, and the people just sort of produced it back up. It's not to say that that wasn't creative, but it was not entrepreneurial. It was sort of receiving bills of service and pushing it back up. So there was no tradition of small business development, entrepreneurial creativity at all. And so we chose to come at it in three ways. First, we just thought we need some kind of system that supports entrepreneurship somehow. And so we created the thing up in the left corner called NEI. This is called the New Economy Initiative. Susan Beresford from the Ford Foundation got the Kellogg Foundation and Kresge to contribute to a large fund whose purpose was to try to create the supports that small businesses would need. We ended up getting 7 or 8 other foundations and building a fund that over the years grew to almost $140 million. And this created early stage investment, it created black box spaces, it created training programs. And one of the direct outcomes of that, if you scroll across to the right, was all of a sudden the private sector started paying attention. And so the Goldman Sachs 10,000 small businesses all of a sudden saw that there was actually something that they could build on. The Bisdom U was developed by Quicken Loans. It would take 20 entrepreneurs a year, run them through a training program, then they'd do business planning, and if the business planning was sufficiently interesting, they would give them their startup capital. And Shinola came out of this program essentially, which is the watch company. I don't know if you guys know the watch company, but they largely employ returning citizens. They have 180 employees, all of whom are returning citizens, 90% of whom are residents of the city of Detroit. On and on and on. We also then realized that that corridor strategy required some specialized investment on the corridor, because this was not sort of small business only, it was other forms of business in lots of forms. And so we created this whole community development finance system. When we started, there wasn't a single CDFI in the city of Detroit. There are now 7 or 8, including a couple of nationals that we brought in through the Living Cities initiative. The Quicken Loans people sort of took to this and created all sorts of infrastructure to support businesses downtown, and we also just needed a lot of co-work sort of startup space. And so the proliferation of these little blue circles was enormous. And finally, and thirdly, we realized that we needed to move into the neighborhoods, and I'll talk more about that, but we needed to move into the neighborhoods with the strategy as well, and we chose to start with the food systems. We have the largest public market in the country, an Eastern Market. It was a perfect vehicle to sort of help small food startups, restaurants, providers, suppliers, food trucks, you name it. And we put a lot of capital into that, as well as into selected small commercial developments in 3 or 4 of the neighborhoods. And the next one, which I've talked to this group previously about, and so I won't bore you too much with it, was sort of the mother of all headaches. This was the idea that in the absence of a public sector, we should actually build a light rail system. Go figure, philanthropy building a trolley car. But the origin story there is after I first came to Detroit, I was asked to talk to a guy named Roger Penske, who was one of our great business leaders, about what he should do after having helped Detroit mount the Super Bowl successfully in 2006, what his next venture should be. And I really didn't know much about Roger. Had I known what I know about him, I would never have had this conversation and never have presumed to tell him what to do. He's really an impressive guy. But I said, well, that's crazy. You've got Woodward corridor, it's 8 lanes, it's all in the public right-of-way. Just run a rail line up and down Woodward corridor and connect it up to the northern suburbs. It goes up 40 miles. I mean, you get a start. Little did I know he would take me seriously, and to make a very long story short, we formed a private philanthropic federal government collaborative that took on the task of trying to create a light rail system in Detroit. The headaches we went through, I won't bore you with. It was unbelievable. We had federal transportation secretaries, federal transit administrators, we had governors, we had city government, all just pushing us into the river at any opportunity.
Including the mayor.
Including the mayor. There's so many stories here. I won't bore you with them, but I'm happy to come back to them. But suffice it to say, we kind of mud wrestled through all of this stuff and actually opened the rail line 2 or 3 years ago. And the important thing there is not to have a little trolley car that just sort of runs up and down because it's sort of looks fun, but it was to create the first leg of a regional transit system. By creating this line, we actually made Detroit eligible for what are called the New Starts monies out of the federal government. Detroit was 434 out of 435 communities before we had the light rail system in terms of eligibility for the New Starts money. After Ray LaHood got done with us, we were number 2. And so the idea was that we could actually use this to get started. That's a longer story. We're still fighting to try to move this into a regional system, but I think actually within the next couple of years we will. And this will become the sort of the first piece of armature in this larger regional system. So the final piece along the corridor strategy that I'll just talk about briefly, but it's almost always underappreciated and undervalued, and that is the importance of an arts ecology to the city. When I came, the Detroit arts ecology was really the yellow box. It was the big houses on the hill. That's an unfortunate term, but it was the big institutional actors, the opera, the Art Institute, the orchestra, a handful of others. And what I think Detroit had never really cultivated was the sort of the whole ecology. Because of course, in the Garden, there are all sorts of well-developed arts organizations equally needing of support who are feeders into the major institutions. Below them are the greenhouses, the people who are trying things who can sort of feed up into the Garden, and beyond that, there are the wilds, all these kind of crazy artists who are moving into abandoned land and doing really interesting work. And what we didn't have was any kind of variegated way of supporting those folks. Some of it was providing real estate investment for these greenhouse organizations who had nowhere to go. Some of it was just basic operating support. In a couple of cases, we had to kind of come and do pre-bankruptcy bailouts of both the opera and the orchestra. They came very close to closing their doors, and we had to, it's a whole other story, we had to put together a whole consortium of funding to make sure they stayed open. And then we developed a whole new program of grants to individual artists and to arts organizations that would be smaller but sort of keep their doors open and encourage individual artists to begin making the kind of contribution to community that we know they could. And underneath that, these 3 boxes underneath were just some of the infrastructure we built to support the entire ecology. But again, these are all longer stories. I apologize for rushing through them, but the arts story in Detroit is a huge, huge driver of what has helped this city regain its feet. We have, in our arts program alone, we have made grants to almost 250 individual artists. Again, they all stay. They all sort of spread into the community. We've made operating support grants every year to 65 arts organizations in the city, and it's created not just stability, but sort of a risk appetite for artists to go into community, try to do things that, of course, nobody else will do, and to sort of tilt against the system in ways that sometimes is hard to do. So that's sort of the corridor. And these are, again, all of the modules. There was an arts module on that first drawing. There was a transit module on the first drawing. There was an entrepreneurial module on the first drawing. And so we've sort of turned those and described the work plan. But probably the most vexing, defining program challenge in the city of Detroit was land use. I mean, I don't know. We still see photos of Detroit that make it look like Dresden. It just bombed out, abandoned houses, rats running in the street, pit bulls, all of the cliches are really true. And so I got a call from newly elected Mayor Bing in 2009, 2010. He had just been elected to take Kwame Kilpatrick's place. And he said, I can't touch land use. It's way too hard. If I threaten to close down neighborhoods or move people, he said, I just can't do it. I need a plan. Can you go get me someone who will do a plan for me? And I said, sort of. I said, what would happen if we went down to New Orleans and asked them to describe how they had sort of done a couple of false starts after Katrina, but had finally developed a way to sort of merge community-based engagement in the future of their city with some very sophisticated technical planning. And so he agreed to that, and we agreed to underwrite it. And I went out and got a world-class planner named Toni Griffin, who had just come off of working with Cory Booker in Newark. And she agreed to come in and do not a plan, but a process to create a framework. And to make, again, a long story short, what she decided to do was to sort of ground all of this in very intense community engagement. We reached over 100,000 Detroiters over the course of 3 years. We did everything from traditional knock-on doors to mobile design units to town halls to electronic platforms to get as much input as we could. But Toni then went out and got 6 or 7 of the deepest technical experts in the world to come talk about water issues, infrastructure issues, housing issues, economic development issues. And the tension zone in the middle was fascinating. I mean, I went to many of these meetings where the technical people would say, given your water quality, this is the only thing you can do. And then someone from the neighborhood would say, well, actually, 6 years ago when we did this, it didn't have the result you think it had. And so this really interesting kind of mixing it up in the middle became essentially the essence of the plan. And after 3 years, including very difficult times with the mayor who felt that this had gotten out of his control, we developed the Detroit Future City Plan with these 6 broad systems or chapters of the plan. Public land, well, you can read them. And the more important thing in many ways was that we felt that having a plan was helpful. The process had been helpful, but ultimately you had to develop implementation capacity around the plan. It just wasn't going to hold. The next administration would have its own plan, and that had happened countless times in Detroit. And so we actually constituted a governance board that sat outside the city that was based on people who had been involved in the community process, who had led the community process. And I stood up when the plan and the governing board were announced, and I said, we're going to create a project implementation board, essentially entity, and every dollar that McKnight, that's interesting, that Kresge Foundation spends in Detroit over the next 5 years will be consistent with that plan, and that's a $150 million commitment. And so all of a sudden, you had someone, an entity that was waking up every day trying to figure out how to execute on this plan, and it was very detailed. It was 400 pages, hundreds and hundreds of pages of detail. And so having someone really think about what a public lands gesture might look like was really important. But they had the money to back up some of these initiatives, and that's exactly what happened. So the first module, probably the most important module of that plan, had to do with a combination of sort of public lands, environmental stewardship. And again, I will just scroll through this very quickly just to suggest that when I started thinking about this was the first module. And when I thought, well, I'm going to lay out the modules for Joel's group, the first module is environmental stewardship. I actually don't think we have much to say. So maybe I'll just skip over that. And then when I thought about it a little bit more, I realized that this has been profound. The possibility to reimagine the landmass of the size of the city of Detroit. And again, Detroit is a large city, 139 square miles. So you can fit San Francisco, Boston, St. Paul, Manhattan in its boundaries and still have room left over. Reimagining its land use along the lines that Mayor Bing had suggested sounded good, but what do you actually put in that, in those spaces? How do you actually convert these derelict, abandoned parcels from a debit to a liability, to an asset? And of course, what we came up with was just sort of infinite possibilities. You can do community gardens. Over on the right, you'll see we developed almost 1,000 community gardens. Some were big, but some were small. Some were apple orchards, some were reforestation projects. It was really quite something. And again, with Eastern Market kind of being the hub. You can use these lands for green-blue infrastructure. And we have one foundation in Detroit who is solely focused on using green-blue infrastructure to help us with stormwater management and the reclamation of polluted lands. You can reclaim neglected public parks. We have a wonderful park to the west called Rouge River Park, which is completely overgrown and just tragic. And we've underwritten with the Sierra Club a massive reimagination of that. The Detroit River Walk was created over a decade ago to sort of take the silos and the sort of the detritus that lay along the Detroit River and convert it into one of the nation's really premier river walks, on and on and on. But there is also just sort of more traditional ways of pursuing environmental sustainability. Detroit actually ended up creating a number of years ago an Office of Sustainability that has gone to work on everything from fleet efficiencies to recycling programs. If you can imagine, 10 years ago, Detroit had no recycling capacity. So small things that seem essential to the public service domain weren't even there. Dedicated bikeway lanes. At first, people just thought this was a huge boondoggle, and they tried to get the mayor to deconstruct them, and then they actually found that people were using them, because almost 40% of Detroiters rely on non-motorized ways of getting around, whether it's to work or to school or to their child care center. And so this sort of suite of activities actually ended up meaning that module on environmental stewardship became much more important, both within the Detroit Future City Plan and also on the big 9-module play. Probably the most important part of the Detroit Future City Plan was the call for neighborhoods of choice, neighborhoods of opportunity, neighborhoods that were complete, that just weren't about housing or weren't sitting on a commercial corridor. And this has been probably the most difficult challenge to crack in Detroit, because as you can see from this drawing, to really create that kind of neighborhood, you need education, you need housing, you need commercial revitalization, you need community engagement mechanisms, you need all sorts of things. So what Kresge has done is to try to go up into northwest Detroit in an area called the Livernois 6 Mile District and take a relatively stable neighborhood, but one sort of at great risk for tipping, and make a whole suite of investments, again, with partners. It's not just Kresge, but a whole suite of partners in that. And I'm going to come back in just a moment to talk about the educational play, but we did something with the Rockefeller and the Knight Foundations called Reimagining the Civic Commons, where we took a large chunk of land, created a greenway, located housing along the greenway, and anchored it at one end with a park. We chose to work with the mayor's office to create a new home mortgage program in an area in which there was relatively stable housing stock, but the valuations just wouldn't support any loans against that stock for rehab or anything else. We stood up a new community engagement structure called the Live 6 Alliance that calls on neighborhood residents to sort of do neighborhood planning and neighborhood engagement. And we also have had a very aggressive program to try to bring small business development to what's called the Avenue of Fashion. This is the old Detroit avenue that ran for almost 2 miles north and south, where all of the African-American owned businesses, not all, so many of the African-American owned businesses were located: hat shops, barber shops, restaurants, and the like. The final piece before I turn to what I think is the most interesting move of the last couple of years is the idea of the health module. The health module was a little bit like the environmental stewardship model. I thought at first, well, I'm not sure I have much to show for that, because we ended up letting the Henry Ford Hospital, Detroit Medical Center, and other major medical institutions sort of find their own way through this time. But what we realized we couldn't do is not figure out some way to address the huge challenge of Detroit's youngest citizens. And so we've developed an early childhood approach focused largely on early childhood health. You can see in the red box the case for doing that. The opportunities for kids 0 to 5 in Detroit are shameful. There are so many families who can't get adequate quality early childhood development care. So many of the kids enter kindergarten just simply not ready to learn. I know a lot of communities face this, but in Detroit, this is just a crippling process, and it leaves the public school system just in an untenable situation. They simply can't take kids who don't have that kind of start and accelerate them into their system. And so we, with the Kellogg Foundation, formed a partnership that was called Hope Starts Here, where we assembled community actors both from the child care community, but also other foundations, public sector actors and the like, to try to create a process where we would sort of sketch out a system of early childhood development, a system that was completely absent in Detroit. We did the same playbook that we used for the Detroit Future City process. We did an intense 2-year-long community engagement to sort of surface up ideas, and again, brought in folks who have done early childhood development, including folks from North Carolina, to help us understand some of the components. The end result of all of that are these 6 priorities over on the right-hand side. And again, I won't walk you through them, but everything from improving facilities quality, because some of these are just reprehensibly terrible, to creating quality standards, to investing in networks of professionals so that they can learn from one another, and identifying new sources of funding. And with a new governor, I think we have some possibilities for doing it. So I think we're well on our way to creating the kind of early childhood development system that may hold promise. So the last module is the education module. And for the first 7 years, Kresge stayed out of K-12 education. I simply could not figure out how to enter a system that is arguably the worst in America, and that is just fraught with politics, union complexity, long-standing work rules, on and on and on and on and on. And then I got a call from the president of something called Mary Grove College. Mary Grove is essentially an HBCU that sits up in that northwest area of the city that I had shown you earlier. And she said, could you assemble a bunch of foundations? We want to pitch a sort of a new business plan because we're really struggling. And so I said, of course, we'd go listen. She pitched a business plan. It seemed questionable, to say the least. And so we did a series of audits of Mary Grove and found that it wasn't malicious or it wasn't intentional, but there was just no there there. They simply didn't have the enrollment. They were carrying too much debt. And we ended up finding that they were burdened by almost $100 million, $20 million of debt from banks, from the county, from the feds. It was just incredible. And so over the next many months, we tried to work with them to see if we couldn't stabilize, remove some of the debt. It turned out we just simply could not. That the college just had no choice but to close. And this was hard because this was a college run by the Sisters of the Immaculate Heart of Mary. And they had been in Detroit for 100 years, and they had educated generations of African American residents in education and teaching, in nursing, and in related health fields. And the idea that this institution would have to put a padlock up on this 53-acre campus, which is a gorgeous campus, was just anathema to everyone. But what to do? And so what we developed was an idea that why couldn't we make this a cradle-to-career campus? Why couldn't we, if we're interested in early childhood, why couldn't we locate an early childhood center on campus? Maybe we could work with the Detroit Public Schools to do something interesting in the K-12 space, or maybe find a charter find some colleges who might be interested, University of Michigan, might be interested in coming onto campus. And then every so often, you need to get lucky. And we did. Because the University of Michigan then came to us through a woman named Dean Moji. Elizabeth Moji is the dean of their School of Education. And she said, I've always harbored the idea that we could do a medical residency model for K-12 teachers, that we would actually bring all of our teaching capacity into a K-12 setting, permit people to get their certification, whether it's an undergraduate or a graduate certification, and then match them up for 3 years with master teachers. So they would serve in that school under the tutelage of really fine teachers. And then we'd cycle all over again. With that cohort would then go off into the Detroit public school system, and we'd bring another cohort in this sort of virtuous loop. And I said, really? You would do that? And she said, oh yeah, she would do that. And so I didn't quite believe her. So I sat down with the president of the University of Michigan, and I said, will you do that? And he said, yes. He said, the University of Michigan has struggled so hard to find a way to land in Detroit that is impactful. And they've done a lot of good work, absolutely a lot of good work. But we need something that really signals that we're behind Detroit. And he said, so we will actually do it. So we then went to the superintendent of schools, who is new, this guy named Nikolai Vitti, came from Miami, he's very good. And he said, you bet. And I said, well, but you've got teacher work rules, you've got board politics, and he said, I've been here 6 months, I will put all my capital on the table, and we will do this. And the result has been this, which is, I think, going to be one of the most spectacular exercises in educational creativity and reinvention anywhere in the country. We are going to break ground in a month on an early childhood center, which will be the first state-of-the-art early childhood center that will, in the city of Detroit. Will serve 200 kids, all of whom will be from the neighborhood and will not be means tested. I mean, it will just be a sort of a mix of subsidized, non-subsidized, full pay, and the like. We'll then hook that early childhood center into the K-12 system, and the University of Michigan is going to create a sort of a learning evaluation cycle that makes sure that they're watching and learning from the early childhood successes, feather that into the K-12 program, and then work to figure out how to get the University of Michigan, as well as some of the other local colleges, to come onto campus and do dual enrollment programs and other things. We just opened the first piece of this, the 9th grade class. It is a neighborhood school. We required that the kids come from a mile or a mile and a half radius. 90% of them do. It violates every Detroit public school regulation there is. But it is Vitti's attempt to do this little orange box at the left, which is to sort of use this as a way to help force innovation in a moribund public school system. We will next year add the 10th grade and the kindergarten. The next year add the 11th grade and the 2nd and 3rd. So within 4 or 5 years, we will have a full P through 12 campus. And then we, over the little on the right, the little pink cloud, we have Wayne State and Oakland University and a handful of others really wanting to bring their programming onto campus. The cool thing about having the University of Michigan on this campus is that Dean Moji, who is a phenom, has already talked to every single one of the other 16 deans and has gotten commitments from every single one of them to be on this campus. Because the K-12 program will be essentially a social justice and engineering program, and so it'll be project-based. And so your School of Architecture comes on site, your engineering school comes on site. They'll also offer both a dental facility and a community health clinic on site. So you bring in the medical school, you bring in the dental school, you bring in the law school to make sure we're not getting in too much trouble. And it's really going to be extraordinary. And forgive my excitement, but this is new since I visited with you last year, and or whenever it was last. And I think it's really a potentially spectacular development. So I probably should stop there. Let me just flash 2 quick slides that sort of are summative. One is at the same time I was drawing the 9 modules, I realized that underneath all of this is what I've just been talking about, is the idea that community engagement needs to infuse every single one of these modules, whether it's education engagement, We have students and community helping us design the Early Childhood Center, design the new build-out of the high school. And importantly, you've just got to have implementation capacity, and this is the single thing Detroit did not have in 2008, is whether it's a CDFI or a Detroit Neighborhood Fellows program or a set of institutions working collectively toward particular ends. It just didn't exist. And so the last slide is just for fun. It is to suggest how we've sort of come at this capacity question. And this you'll just have to look at in your own time. These are just different ways we've sought to build capacity over this decade. In some cases, it's just direct leadership development, like the Detroit Neighborhood Fellows Program. In other cases, it's neighborhood project support, where we just provide neighborhoods with re-granting monies. In other cases, it's actually providing direct investments in community development organizations. We have citywide intermediaries that do this work that we invest in. This is a complex bit of work, and it's very hard to understand how these 9 modules would have stayed afloat without these investments. So I'm sorry for the goofy machines. I'm not sure. I think I must have been on drugs, but it was it was just fun. So I think what I would leave you with is that, you know, in 2008, when we drew that 9-part plan, I'm not sure we really could comprehend the extent to which it would become the blueprint for the revitalization of the city. And I don't mean to minimize lots and lots of hands in this work. If we had more time, I would talk about that. But the point is that we needed a framework. We needed a set of directions. We needed a set of animating principles. We then needed to turn it on its side and create work plans and work the plan. And I hope what you've seen is that we did. We actually stuck to every one of those modules. We've done other work as well that I haven't talked about. But I think the result is a city that is fundamentally recalibrated in its essence. It is a much more distributive model of governance. Community, foundations, private sector, public sector. It's not the command and control of the autos. It's not the command and control of a traditional mayor's office. It's highly interdisciplinary. I mean, you can see all this stuff is all interwoven. And it's deeply cross-sectoral. The philanthropy has got to get comfortable working with the public sector. Public sector has got to get comfortable working with philanthropy. The private sector has got to get comfortable working with both. And so I think what you've got is this really interesting alchemy that has gone on in Detroit. And I think over time, it will be almost more important than the individual projects. It's this machinery of decision-making, of problem-solving, and of change that I think will define the Detroit into the future. And that's why I'm optimistic. Some of these things may fall. I mean, maybe even the Marygrove stuff may not work. But I think they will, because I think we're creating sort of structures of change that will endure. So I'm sorry to go quite so long, but that's the story.
Fantastic. Well, I hope you all feel as elated as I am about this. I mean, you don't see discussions and analyses of public problems like this,
Sorry.
which such whimsy but also wisdom at the same time. Putting them all together gives you an entirely different sense of not only the complexity of them, but also where the leverage opportunities are. And that may be the most important thing that comes out of these slides, but the fact that it was his mind that put them all together and worked them through in a very complex city with great problems. So I thank you for enlightening us all.
Thank you.